From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It wasn't that long ago that people were shocked by the idea of a female priest.
I mean, do you remember 15 years ago when I first came to this parish, women priests were a whole new concept. And actually I did encounter a certain amount of prejudice myself. Mainly from you sexist pig.
And when this episode of The Vicar of Dibley was first broadcast in 2013, women may have become vicars, but it was still impossible to become a bishop.
I would ask you to consider both the argument for women bishops, that's 4 women bishops, and also you should look carefully at the masquerading as an argument against women bishops.
It was a timely comedy that poked fun at an awkward moment for the church, but also helped to win hearts and minds, and helped to bring about the cultural change that was needed to make people less afraid of allowing women to hold senior positions in the church. It wasn't all plain sailing, though.
Members of the Church of England General Synod have blocked the ordination of women bishops.
It was carried in the House of Bishops and Clergy and lost in the House of Laity.
But the rules did change. And now we're about to welcome the first female Archbishop of Canterbury.
The first reaction I had was a great surprise, really. I had to ask them to repeat what they had just said so I could properly make sure I could hear it.
At Dame Sarah Mullally's confirmation ceremony later this week, she will become the leader of the Church of England and the ceremonial head of the worldwide Anglican Communion. But it's still proving controversial in some quarters.
The Church of Nigeria has described this decision as devastating.
It's very dangerous. It's not scriptural, it's man-made. Let the white West world don't feel that they know more than God.
Could a female Archbishop of Canterbury spark a schism in the Anglican Communion? With culture wars and historic sexual abuse scandals still clinging to the church, what are the challenges she'll inherit? And what do we know about the woman who'll be taking them on? The story today: who is Dame Sarah Mullally, the first female Archbishop of Canterbury?
Well, we all remember when Pope Francis died, they had a new pope in place within about, I think it was something like 17 days last year.
That's Burgess, religious affairs correspondent at The Times.
It's taken almost 13 months after Justin Welby resigned as Archbishop of Canterbury, but on Wednesday, January 28th, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally, will formally take up the role.
No white smoke at all.
No white smoke at all. No, it's called a confirmation of election ceremony at St Paul's Cathedral.
But it is a really big moment because this is the first female Archbishop of Canterbury.
Exactly. She's the 106th. That goes back to St Augustine in the year 597. And yes, it's the first female Archbishop of Canterbury, or first female Archbishop in the Church of England, full stop. And it's the earliest opportunity at which there could have been one. Women were only able to become bishops just over 10 years ago. This is the first time the Archbishop of Canterbury role has come up, and it's gone to a woman.
How big a moment is that?
It is a very big moment. I think Sarah Mullally herself tried to sort of downplay it and say this shouldn't be a big deal.
You know, it is the working out of a decision that was made 30 years ago to ordain women. And I'm really grateful for all those that at that time did that work to bring about that change in the Church of England.
We've had women priests for 30 years. We've had women bishops for over a decade. It feels natural.
But also it is, it is important because it says something to the world about the church, and also it says something to women.
She was the Bishop of London, which is the third most senior post.
I often, at the moment of the Bishop of London, will go into a classroom in which have men and women students in there. And what I watch is when I talk about what I'm doing and where I am, people will sit up and listen, and therefore it enables them to think, well, actually, maybe I can imagine. I can imagine that my dreams could be possible.
And yet, of course, it's
We've
a big
had
deal.
a queen for a very long time who's effectively the head of the Church of England.
Exactly, yes. You always have to be careful when you talk about the most senior role in the Church of England. Well, that's the supreme governor, the monarch. But yes, exactly. So it is a big deal. It's not as controversial as it could have been. I don't think it really is that controversial. I think when it comes to traditionalists, they'll be looking more closely at her views on things like same-sex marriage and so on than they will necessarily at the fact that she's female. There are parts of the Anglican communion around the world that still don't accept women in leadership, and so that is going to be a little bit of an issue for her to overcome. But even then, she has been embraced by large parts of the global Anglican world.
And in terms of the ceremonial part of all of this, you mentioned the confirmation in St. Paul's, but there's another ceremony to come.
Well, actually, rewinding slightly, there were 3 ceremonies, and the first was one that I got invited to, which has never been done in public before, which is called the election in the ancient chapter house at Canterbury Cathedral, where there are electors, and it's a sort of slightly sham election. They have a piece of paper with just the one name on it, and the king essentially says, please choose it. But then they elect her, and it's this big screw seal is placed on the certificate, and she's elected. This week is the confirmation of election, where fellow bishops come together at St. Paul's to kind of rubber stamp that, and she starts the role. But then in March is the enthronement. That's the real pomp. There are 2 thrones involved. There's a cathedral. A cathedral is actually an adjective. It's a cathedral church because a cathedra is the throne on which a bishop sits and exercises their authority. So each diocese has a cathedral church, which is essentially the church where the bishop's cathedra or throne is kept. So there's a diocesan one because she'll be in charge of the Canterbury diocese. But then there's this marble 13th century throne which archbishops have been enthroned on for centuries, and she will be enthroned on that, and there'll be a huge amount of ceremony, and the Prince of Wales is likely to be there as well.
The Archbishop of Canterbury is obviously a hugely important role in the British state, really. And as you say, it has a very, very, very long history. So, as our religious affairs correspondent, just give us a potted version of that.
Potted history. So
a potted history.
It was St. Augustine who was Italian born, and he was sent by Pope Gregory the Great to bring Christianity to King Ethelbert and sort of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So that was the very first. And you're talking sort of 1400 odd years ago. Another Italian-born monk known as Lanfranc was the first after William the Conqueror's invasion in 1066, and he helped to sort of integrate England's churches under the kind of Norman system. Thomas Becket, of course, was assassinated in Canterbury Cathedral by Henry II's knights.
Who will rid me of
this turbulent priest, indeed, 1170. And then Simon Sudbury had his head chopped off during the Peasants' Revolt in the 14th century.
What did he do to deserve that?
Wasn't a peasant, I think.
No, I can see that would be a problem.
To horribly oversimplify it. Thomas Cranmer, some people count the Church of England's history from the Reformation because they think, well, before that, it was just a sort of branch of the Catholic Church. Thomas Cranmer helped Henry VIII to split away from Rome. You know, he became the head of the church, Henry VIII. The role was vacant for 15 years during the Commonwealth after the Civil War.
What happened there? We thought 13 months was bad.
Well, exactly. That was just the authority of the church being completely sort of put to one side during that whole Commonwealth period, and then until William Juxon was brought back in. And then when we were talking about Justin Welby's resignation, the only even remote precedent for it was William Sancroft, who refused to pledge his allegiance to William and Mary in 1619, so was deprived of the role, which essentially means sacked. But Justin Welby, of course, was the first person to actually resign for an issue of, mishandling his responsibilities in the role.
That really is a potted history, and excellent knowledge. Well done. We are now on to the very first female Archbishop of Canterbury. Tell us a bit about her.
Her background, she mentions this quite a lot, a bit like the way that, we hear Keir Starmer talk about his dad being a toolmaker relatively often.
I have heard that before.
He has mentioned it. Sarah Mullally was England's chief nursing officer and was the youngest person ever to take that role.
So she's had a whole career before the church.
Yeah, she talks about how she came to faith really as a teenager. She was born in 1962 in Woking and went to the William Churchill Comprehensive School, which is a good, establishment sounding school to have gone to. She became a Christian as a teenager about the age of 16.
Growing up, we went to church regularly, not always with my parents. My grandparents took us. So we all went to church, and I joined a youth group.
And I think she's talked about having felt a calling.
I had a sense from then that I probably wanted to do something that was about living that Christian faith out.
But of course, at that point, we're talking the 1970s,
And of course, at that time, women weren't ordained in the church, so that wasn't anything that ever entered my head.
And so her kind of calling took her into nursing.
Being a nurse was a vocation. At first, I did think about becoming a doctor, and this may offend doctors now, but I had a sense that actually nurses provided much more holistic care. They were often with patients for longer periods of time, sometimes in those difficult moments, so therefore chose to become a nurse.
And she was a cancer nurse. She studied at Southbank Polytechnic.
One of the very early degrees in nursing, and I was at the Nightingale School of Nursing and the Southbank Poly to do that.
And she became the youngest ever Chief Nursing Officer for England in 1999.
Wow.
Before then, obviously by this point, it was possible for women to become priests from the early 90s, and so she followed that calling. And actually, she said it was a really hard decision to actually kind of quit the nursing role and go full-time into being a priest.
We'd just been to Slovenia on a holiday. I'm not very adventurous, but one of the things we did with my children was canyoning. And basically when you go up this beautiful mountain, but you come down via the waterfalls. And I went up and I had done all the check on the company. They gave me the sort of hard hat and the life preserver. And, I walked up with this chap and I checked that we were safe in his hands. And so you walk up and at some point, you have to take that step down this slide. And for me, I did all the head stuff. I did all of that. But at some point, I think as a Christian, you have to take that step off and put your faith in Jesus Christ.
So she quit being the most senior nurse in the country, effectively, in order to take up this ambition to go into
That's why she left nursing.
the church.
Yeah.
Amazing. And what do we know about her family?
She's got 2 children, and her husband is Irish-born. Eamon, I think, was actually brought up as a Roman Catholic, but is now worships in the Church of England.
Just as well.
Indeed. She's kind of risen quite quickly. I remember going to cover the announcement of the new Bishop of London in 2018, and there's a sort of strange hierarchy where you have the Archbishop of Canterbury is sort of number 1 and Archbishop of York number 2, and then you have the Bishop of London is sort of seen as sort of the third most senior, and then you have the Bishops of Durham and Winchester kind of come next. And again, there had never been a female Bishop of London, and she kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't really see her on anybody's list of the potential candidates.
Oh, really?
So even that was a historic moment to be the first female Bishop of London, which meant that, her name then was in the frame when it came to looking for a successor for Justin Welby, where people were wondering who it could be.
How did she do as Bishop of London?
London's a really unusual diocese. The previous Bishop of London had to put a whole system in place where he didn't ordain anyone as priest because he didn't want to annoy people by ordaining women. So having a woman come in was a big deal, and I think she's been seen as having dealt with that quite well. However, the Diocese of London has had quite a few controversies over the handling of different sort of safeguarding cases and some kind of tragic cases, some of which came across Sarah Mullally's desk at various points, and so there have been criticisms of her personally for these things kind of having happened on her watch and how she handled them.
Well, we'll come back to those in a moment. Before we do, though, from everything we've seen of her, from being Chief Nursing Officer to Bishop of London, what kind of a person is she? What do we know about her personality?
She's quite guarded and quite careful, which I think is understandable, especially in the last few months before taking up the role.
I'm a comprehensive girl, I've got dyslexia. And there is a sense in which I slightly feel the church has never quite worked me out. So this thing always about me, a slight insecurity about who I am.
But she's very outspoken when she sort of feels she needs to be. Her big thing she's been campaigning against is the assisted dying bill.
My concern is the real risk of direct and indirect pressure on the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people should this bill be passed.
And she's been using her kind of nursing background and cancer nursing background to speak on that very strongly.
My message to MPs is, if you have serious doubts, don't assume they will be addressed at the later stages. I urge you to simply vote against the bill.
She hasn't been that outspoken on some of the other social issues. For example, the same-sex marriage debate, which has been rumbling on in the church for 13, 14 years. She's been kind of careful on that front.
Would you bless a same-sex marriage?
At the moment, there is no provision in the Church of England to do that.
Would you like there to be that provision?
As I said, there is a period of reflection that is going on at the moment.
She sort of holds to the traditional teaching on marriage being between a man and woman, but is very welcoming of the changes that have been made to allow priests to bless gay couples. And so people have, struggled to place her completely on, she's a liberal or she's a traditionalist. And so she's quite kind of careful on that front.
Very careful. Has she talked about herself much during that period?
When she became Bishop of London, she sort of said, she used the word subversive in the sense of it's a woman coming in for the first time as Bishop of London, and therefore
subversive in its own right.
Exactly, that is in itself subversive. And I think she used the phrase, "I don't come carrying bombs," which was a kind of reference to sort of the suffragette movement, and saying, I've not come here to kind of cause chaos, but I've come here to say, look, I'm here and in my role. And she spoke out quite strongly as well about misogyny in the church.
In Durham, there was no female clergy. In Exeter, no female clergy. In Coventry, no female clergy. One in Winchester, one in Soderham Man, one in Ely, one in Ebbs and Itches.
And how, female priests have for decades faced, I think the term she used was microaggressions.
The truth is that women continue to be underrepresented. Women's voices continue not to be heard. There continues to be institutional barriers. We continue to experience microaggressions.
And she got quite tearful when addressing the Church of England Synod on that topic, which I think was seen as a really powerful moment for someone that senior to speak so openly about it. And she's been quite honest in different things like the debate on abortion, for example. She's talked about how she finds herself being pro-choice as a general case for the law of the land, but that she would probably herself would not have been felt able to go through with terminating a pregnancy, and so sort of pro-choice for others, but maybe pro-life for herself, if that makes sense. And so she's...
Yeah, a dual view
addressing,
on it, really.
addressing the nuance. There was one moment that stood out as well, that when Justin Welby had to resign, but was still in post, he gave a sort of valedictory speech in the House of Lords.
There comes a time, if you are technically leading a particular institution or area of responsibility, where the shame of what has gone wrong, whether one is personally responsible or not, must require a head to roll. And there is only, in this case, one head that rolls well enough.
Which he was quite heavily criticised for, because it had quite a frivolous, jokey tone.
If you pity anyone, pity my poor diary secretary, who's seen weeks and months of work disappear in a puff of a resignation announcement.
And there was a lot of people sort of chortling around him, but she was noticed for sitting next to him very stony-faced and disapproving, which I think reflected quite well on her, given the tone of the speech. It's going to be her position on all these kind of cultural, social issues within the church, issues more globally, that are going to decide the extent to which these splits in the church either heal or widen, both in England and abroad.
Kaya, you've told us a bit about the woman who's about to take up the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury. While describing her time as the Bishop of London, you did mention there were some controversies. Tell us a bit about that.
There are a number of bishops who will be receiving reports that a particular priest in their diocese, in their sort of jurisdiction, has allegedly committed some sort of abuse or offence, and they have to sort of often decide what the next step is in a kind of disciplinary sense. And so when bishops have complaints of this nature, it's often to do with how they handled those cases. And it emerged at the Times, we broke the story a month or so ago, that someone had made a formal complaint to the church's sort of disciplinary process about her in 2020, and that the church had thought that the complaint had been dropped, but that was apparently a mistake, and so they had to reopen it about a month ago. And this was an individual who's only known as Survivor N, who accused a priest in the Diocese of London of abuse. And he alleges that Sarah Mullally, when this came across her desk, directly contacted the priest involved about the allegations immediately, which is not what you're supposed to do as protocol in that kind of instance, and made the complaint. And so suddenly you had this issue where, of course, Justin Welby had to resign because of concerns and criticisms over his handling of abuse allegations. And suddenly is the same thing hanging over the next Archbishop of Canterbury. The complaint was dismissed, but there was criticism over the process because the person who dismissed the complaint was her kind of closest ranking colleague, the Archbishop of York.
So this is the complaint against her
against
was
her,
dismissed?
Yeah, against her for her handling of a report of abuse against a priest, yeah.
Yeah, but it was dismissed by somebody she was...
Yeah, so the church's laws set out that if there's a complaint against one of the archbishops, it's the other archbishop who kind of looks into it. But of course, this is the criticism from lawyers and survivors that it's very kind of incestuous, and surely there should be some sort of independent oversight. And so
feels quite cosy within the church.
Exactly, and that's how the church's laws state that it should be handled, but that, according therein, is the problem. And there was also a very tragic case of a priest who took his own life after completely unsubstantiated allegations were made, and that obviously happened under Sarah Mullally's watch, without her having a huge amount of direct involvement in it. But again, it was just that, how did her diocese handle these cases while she was in charge? Because, of course, that's the thing that people are going to be looking at most closely for her, probably. How is she going to overhaul the way the church deals with these sorts of abuse complaints?
What has she said about this? Because it's difficult coming in having that hanging over you. What has she said about it?
She has said how seriously she takes safeguarding, and she has to know that it's got to be top of the kind of priority list. And she said, the way she's addressed all of these in the last kind of couple of months is by saying, as I prepare to become Archbishop of Canterbury, there will be renewed scrutiny of past cases and especially my role. And she says that she completely understands and kind of welcomes the spotlight being shone, but, evidently feels that she has, not behaved improperly in these cases.
Do you think that draws a line under the whole thing, or could it come back yet to haunt her?
Well, that particular case I referred to is going to still rumble on, in that the church came out and said that this particular case had been dealt with fully, and the survivor has now come back and said that's not the case and has lodged a new complaint over that remark. And there are people even saying that perhaps her taking up the role should be postponed until a line can be drawn, but these cases do tend to rumble on for kind of quite a long time.
So we know that case will be rumbling on while she's in office. What else does she have facing her? What are the challenges? What's in her in tray?
There's a mix between internal and sort of global things, essentially. And, people will say to archbishops constantly, they should stay out of politics and stick to religion. And they come back and say, well, actually, if you read the Bible, Jesus was quite political, and so they can defend it. But, that's going to be a big challenge. She's going to continue fighting on assisted dying to try and oppose that. Within the church, there are still these huge divisions over issues to do with same-sex relationships. Are they going to allow same-sex couples to have standalone blessing ceremonies in church? Gay priests are allowed to have civil partnerships. Will they be allowed to have civil weddings? And they've just kicked that down. And that's created a really huge rift. The culture wars essentially are kind of infecting the church as they are.
Still raging
everywhere
inside
else.
The church,
Yeah, exactly.
And what about numbers? How healthy is the church looking?
We're in a really fascinating point at the moment where there are lots of these claims going around that there is a kind of Christian revival underway in Britain, propped up by some sort of surprising surveys that some statisticians who followed these things for decades say these look kind of quite like outliers. And when you look at the Church of England, like everywhere else, their attendance figures clearly plummeted in 2020 because of COVID lockdowns.
Yeah.
And then slowly but surely, the last 3 or 4 years, they've ticked back up again. And these are the first years in 50 years that there's ever been any increases in attendance, because it's been a decline since the 60s. And so they're saying, look, growing attendances. But you're saying, well, they're still only rebounding from the pandemic, and they're still a long way below where they were in 2019, and it's plateauing. And so the tricky thing is going to be is only time will tell.
And you mentioned there are also sort of global problems. She won't be popular across the Church of England.
No, there are still about 600 churches or parishes in the Church of England out of about 12,000, so it's about 5%, I think, who formally reject women as church leaders. They're allowed to kind of sign this sort of resolution, it's called, to say we don't want a woman leading our parish, we don't want a woman bishop overseeing us.
Wow.
And there are clearly Anglican churches abroad in different countries that don't have women bishops at all. And clearly she is still the kind of main figurehead of the Anglican communion. That's going to be rowed back slightly to be a bit slightly more rotating, but she's still the spiritual leader, really. And so a big part of her role is going to be trying to stop Anglican churches in sort of what they call the global south from just saying, you know what, we're going to completely split away and do our own thing, which is a threat.
Because there is often the sort of threat of schism at Synod when, a lot of these Anglican churches from the global south do already threaten to go because of a lot of liberal values, but certainly female priests.
Yeah, exactly.
Could this be the moment that really sets that off?
I still think the question of sexuality and same-sex relationships is higher in people's minds.
Really?
There was a small kind of faction that sort of said we reject the Archbishop of Canterbury's leadership altogether, and people thought, is that because she's a woman? This is after Sarah Mullally was named, and you thought, well, that was certainly probably playing into it, but it was probably more the fact that she hadn't stood up and opposed same-sex blessings. And then, of course, Justin Welby and Pope Francis struck up an extremely close personal and professional relationship. How will Sarah Mullally's relationship with Pope Leo? Will they travel to kind of joint reconciliation war zones together? That will be quite interesting to watch as well. And I think just broadly how her relationship is with with government, there's a really fractious relationship when Welby criticised the Rwanda deportation scheme, and how will she play that? Will she be like, I'm going to kind of rile the government up in these sorts of moments, or will it, it's very hard to tell.
And Welby, before the moment when he had to resign and the scandal sort of broke, was seen as a successful Archbishop of Canterbury by many people. He was a good communicator. As you say, he was taking on big issues, travelling with the Pope. How do you think she'll compare?
Again, when you talk about the culture wars, in terms of Justin Welby being seen as a good archbishop, it sort of depends who you ask and if they like the fact that he kind of was quite liberal on some things, and people felt maybe he spent a bit too much time desperately trying to keep the Anglican communion together and could have focused more on struggling parishes in this country. That's another big thing that she's got to deal with. This growing movement in the church which says that the church has sort of been neglecting its old-fashioned, dwindling, rural parish congregations and is spending too much money on fancy new types of churches, meeting in cafes, or money on sort of slavery reparations, and that's going to be something she's going to have to kind of work quite hard on. It's all kind of on a knife edge, case by case, on how she weighs in on some of these big debates. How does she respond to the growing use of Christian symbols in far-right rallies? Suddenly you've got the Lord's Prayer being said at nationalist rallies. Does the Church of England decry that, but then it might be seen as a bit sort of snobbish? She's got a lot of challenges from day one.